Welcome, everyone, to the Fall 2022 Southeast Asia in Transition webinar series. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Courtney Work. I'm an assistant professor at the National Chengche University, and I will be the moderator for today's session. And I'm super excited because in this segment of the Luce Southeast Asia in Transition webinar series, we're going to explore the story of development from varied perspectives. We're going to put local interactions with the development paradigm and the more than human world into a broad conversation. So we're going to pick up where the last series left off, exploring through film the Mekong River as a living entity. And we have invited speakers who will talk about, engage with, and experience development through various relationships with the land, with the dead, with the living world of fish, frogs, rice, and trees. And we're going to hear about development from people who share different perspectives and experiences in these matters. Our speakers include academics, practitioners, and local voices. And the conversations will reveal what development looks like from a mix of viewpoints and social positions. So this is the first session in our series. The link to introduce you to the other sessions is in the chat box, so you can check out what we'll be doing through the course of this fall. And today, I'm excited to introduce and welcome into conversation four actors who will help us discuss development. The first is Chan Sopiak, who is a professor at the Royal University of Phnom Penh, and this year is a research fellow with the Mekong Culture Well Project at Michigan State University. I'd like to also welcome Amy Weissman, who is the Deputy Regional Director and Technical Director of FHI 360's Asia Pacific Regional Office. We will welcome Media Lin, Elna Anak Mukan, who is the Iban Community Representative for Minority Report. And we'll welcome Sophie Chow, who is the Discovery and Early Career Research Award Fellow and the lecturer in anthropology at the University of Sydney. So each of our panelists are going to take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and their research and their take on what it means to discuss development. And so I am going to stop talking now, and I'm going to invite Chan Sopiak to begin and share with us what he thinks. Sopiak, you unmute your microphone, please. Sopiak, can you unmute your microphone?
Okay, thank you, Courtney, for the introduction. And here, my name is Sopiak Chan. I am from Royal University of Phnom Penh. And today is my talk. I am a geographer. I have been working on the Mekong for over 15 years now. And my research interest is political ecology of the post-conflict resource frontiers. And currently I have been interested in emotional political ecology. And my talk today will explain why emotions have become an important aspect of studying environment and development. After completing my PhD in 2017, I have been engaged in research relating to social environmental development in the Mekong. One in particular, I have learned more about impacts of dams on life, depending on the land and water of the Mekong. This experience has deeply influenced my emotional, spiritual, and intellectual well-being. I have learned through engaging with people, experience of the impacts of the dams from those whose homes were flooded by the reservoir of the lower Sesan II, and the fishermen to the Tonle Sap who have lost their livelihood because the fish is depleting. So, and here, the picture here is a pictures of, in the picture is the man who ran a ferry across the reservoir of the lower Sesan 2, taking people who live in now 2 different villages called Sreko Jas or Old Sreko and Sreko Tmai or New Sreko. These 2 villages were once before and now is flooded, and some refused to relocate and some by the government and the developers, so they live nearby the flooded village called the Sreko, the Old Sreko or Sreko Jas. And the other group accept the compensation arranged by the government and the developer, and they relocate to where the developer sent them to. It's called Sreko Tmai. And the boatmen carrying the passenger from one side of the reservoir through the others across the flooded village, sitting on the boat. My question was, what is this in his mind? What is seeing every day? Can he overcome this? How does this emotional world operate with the impact of that development? To the other side is the that picture is a picture of the tonle sap. The fishermen have complaints that they can't survive without with only fishing anymore. In June this year, fishermen in Kampung Pluk, in Siem Reap and Chnok Tru in Kampung Chnang were looking at the water level of the Tonle Sap Lake. Some said the water used to normally rise up during this time, and the water would rise up gradually every day around 10 centimeters a day. But this year the water rise up yesterday and drop again today. If the water is not rising gradually, the plant would die and the water would smell and the fish can't lay eggs, and there will be no fish for the next seasons. Some fishermen said the water is blocked from the upstream dams. Some said it was called Tumnop Sesan or Sesan 2 Dam or Sesan Dam. In Chnok Tru, the fishermen, the fishing community was relocated. Some people said the government told them that they can't live on the water because there is no fish, and that their life would not be healthy and stable if they keep living on the water. So they were sent onto the lands. And that means that they need to be developed. A 20-year-old woman said she's missing her old home floating on the lake. Even though the house was small and old, they lived together. Now some migrate to find job outside, and those staying can no longer live near the lake or on the lake. It is important that, so in conclusion, it is important that to understand the impact, we must not only look at the changing of the material world as separate out of our emotional and spiritual well-being. As a researcher, I can only reach this level of understanding when I'm emotionally exposed and fully experienced. That's all for me today, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Sapek. Very nice. Very nice. Amy, can you follow?
Sure. Thanks, Courtney. I'd like to thank you and the organizers for inviting me to join you today for this session. And I wish you all a very good morning from Bangkok, Thailand, which is where I'm calling in from. My name is Amy Weissman. I'm a global health practitioner, and I've been living outside the United States, my home country, for nearly 20 years now. To begin today, I would like to talk about a time many years ago now when I was a volunteer at a sexual and reproductive health organization. This was a time when contraceptive and abortion services were legal in the United States, so access should have been guaranteed, but it wasn't. Protesters filled the sidewalks and were yelling and waving graphic images, which made it really difficult for women to fulfill their right to health. These kinds of injustices are all too common around the globe, both across and within countries. And one of the starkest and most recent examples of such an injustice is vaccine access during the COVID-19 pandemic. Although much of the world has access now, early in the pandemic, only 0.1% of the 500 million vaccines that had been administered were done in low-income countries. So given the pervasiveness of health injustices and the importance of addressing them, I'd like to share a few thoughts from my own experience working toward health equity. And by equity, I mean access to accurate, high quality, culturally relevant, stigma-free health information and services. So the first thought I have is that there's a real need to balance evidence with the right to choose. When I was working in Cambodia years ago, women were at very high risk of dying in childbirth. In response, efforts focused on strengthening the health system to provide facility-based deliveries. And you have to ask, is this what women wanted and what they needed? Certainly most want to deliver their babies safely. Of course, women want to survive and they want their babies to survive. But what if a woman wants to deliver at home, which was becoming popular at the time in Northern Europe? In Cambodia, the public health community was pushing a single solution rather than making all options available and safe. Yet to ensure equity, we really need to ensure that people have choice. The second thought I have is that it's really critical that local actors are at the center of our efforts. Unfortunately, though, this really isn't always the case. I recall a project in ethnic minority communities of Vietnam, where the project staff were from the Kin majority. They did not speak the ethnic minority languages. They did not understand or respect the local culture or context. And unsurprisingly, this project was not effective. So instead, I want to take a moment and just imagine what would have happened if more authority and responsibility had been in the hands of the ethnic minority communities. My third point is that we have to fight against the power and money that drives our choices. And sometimes they do this without our even knowing it. Big companies have really big power and they prioritize profit over the public's health, even when they know that their products are harmful. So take, for example, the tobacco industry. It is now well known that they buried the health harms of their products. And yet, even after having been called out in the United States, they continue to push their products in other countries. Fortunately, more and more big companies are unable to hide the consequences of their products, but it still happens. And we need to work to make it stop because we absolutely have the right to know the risks that we take. Yet knowing those risks isn't always enough, which brings me to my fourth and final point. And that is that structural change is needed to support our ability to make healthy choices. For example, there's evidence that breastfeeding is best for moms and babies. However, not all women can choose to breastfeed if they wish to do so. To support women to have this choice, we've worked hard in Vietnam and across the region and beyond to successfully advocate for extending maternity leave policies and to give working moms the opportunity to continue breastfeeding once they go back to work. We've established breastfeeding centers and rooms and supplied breast pumps in factories and workplaces around the region. So across these examples that I shared from my experience in the United States and Southeast Asia, I think there's an underlying thread. And for me, that thread is about human rights and equity. And that's because I believe if we're going to make a meaningful impact, we have to keep human rights and equity at the center of all of our development work. Thanks, Courtney.
Nice, nice. Thank you so much, Amy. Good. Okay, so can we hear from Midjalin? Thank you.
Hi, all right, thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to say thank you for Courtney and the organizer for inviting me to be one of the panelists for this webinar. To everyone, my name is Midjalin Ernanak Mukan, and I am Iban. Iban is one of the indigenous tribe that is native to the Borneo Island. Today, I will be speaking as a representative of Minority Report, an organization that facilitates platform for minority youth to voice out their opinions, perspective, raise awareness towards our heritage and culture, and to initiate action to uplift other youths that share similar upbringing. I would be bringing my perspective on development based on my experience growing up as a minority in Brunei, as well as what I have witnessed of my relatives in our neighboring country, Sarawak, Malaysia. I have worked and facilitated numerous workshops that is that focuses on digital literacy to promote self-development among the ethnic minorities. For one, I was the sign language translator for the Heart on Hearing under Go Digital campaign of Big Bagawan. I was also the moderator for 3 Youth Open Space online series, where one of the topic is ethnic minorities role and Brunei's Darussalam 2035 National Development Plan. Development from my point of view is a way for both state and non-state actors to react to its inevitable force of globalizations and modernization, be it through building physical infrastructure, catalyzing the economic growth, or even the shift in the mindset that prioritizes capitals over heritage. Growing up, I have seen both the bad and the good sides of development. So it is a rather interesting conflict for me to approach. On one side of the coin, it offers an upgrade, I would say, to the standard of living, especially for the rural area, as it makes it easier to access basic necessities such as internet connections or even electricity. On the other hand, I have witnessed how development, if it is not handled with care, could threaten the life of my tribe's people, as well as other ethnic minorities within the Borneo Islands, and perhaps it could even threaten their identities as the ethnic minority groups. All right, that's all for me.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Media Len, for this perspective. And now, last but certainly not least, I will invite Sophie to join us and tell us what she thinks.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I too want to start by thanking the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to be in conversation with Sofiak, with Amy, with Midialin, and with everyone who's joining us online. Even though we're meeting in a somewhat disembodied mode, I still want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm speaking to you from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Darumuragal people of the Darug Nation here in Australia. And I want to acknowledge Gadigal and Darug elders, past, present, and emergent, and also Gadigal and Darug kin, both human, animal, vegetal, and elemental. So I'm Sophie Chow, I'm an environmental anthropologist, and I want to take the next 5 minutes or so to share with you some insights into the story and practice of development as these are articulated by indigenous Marine and Nim peoples in the Indonesian colonized region of West Papua, where I've been conducting long-term ethnographic fieldwork and investigative research over the course of the last decade. In this last decade, Maroons have come to know or encounter development primarily in the form of industrial oil palm plantation expansion. Plantations now cover some 1 million hectares of lands that were formerly forested and that Maroons traditionally depended on for their everyday subsistence through hunting, fishing, and gathering. What came out incredibly strongly in the course of my conversations and apprenticeship among the Marind was the importance of thinking about development projects like plantation expansion in the idiom or through the lens of justice. Justice for Marind is indissociably tethered to development. And more than that, it's not just about justice for the people who are subject to the positive and negative effects of development, as Midialin touched on. It's also about justice for the plants, animals, ecosystems, rivers, soils, mountains, whom Marind talk about as their kin and with whom they entertain both intimate and ancestral relations of common descent from ancestral spirits. What does it change to think about development through multi-species justice? Well, it pushes beyond a nature-culture divide. It brings into the fold local actors that include non-human beings that humans depend upon for their well-being and who humans can also sustain through their own kind of activities. Thinking about development through the lens of multi-species justice also makes us think about development in intergenerational terms, not just a 5-year development plan or a 35 or 50-year development plan, but as my Papuan friends call for, a 1,000-year development plan, a 5,000-year development plan. When you start to think about development in those sorts of terms, the longue durée of multi-species and multi-generational justice, something shifts. Different kinds of accountabilities arise. Latent impacts in the long-term future suddenly become to matter and materialize in different kinds of ways. And finally, I want to touch on another dimension of development and justice that's often invoked by my Indigenous Papuan instructors and mentors. And this is the importance of thinking about justice and development through affect. And Sofiak spoke to this directly and very powerfully just now in conjuring the emotional dimensions of environmental change. For Marind, who are seeing their lands converted to plantations, often without their free, prior, or informed consent, and to the detriment of their cosmological, interpersonal, and multi-species relations, development comes with all kinds of conflictual emotions: rage, anger, frustration, deception, grief, mourning, possibility, hope, promise. All of these affects matter to the stories and the storying of development. And all of these emotions are things that people want to talk about and deem important to talk about in forging or fashioning other developments or developments otherwise. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your attention.
Nice. Oh, lovely. Thank you all so much for such a rich beginning, opening to our discussion. I just want to take a minute and ask our audience to write into the chat box any questions that you have as we go along. We will be gathering questions as we go along. And so if you're struck with a question for one of our panelists or for the group together, please just write your question into the chat box and we will gather those up. And at the end of our discussion, we will leave at least a half an hour for us to answer questions from you all and continue our discussion. So feel free to add questions into the chat box right now, or you can wait till the question and answer period. There's some really nice connections going through these introductions, and I'm particularly struck by two things. Well, three things, five things. No, two things I think that I'll pull out though. That the one Sophie hit it really nicely is this business of generations and intergenerational understandings of what it is we are doing. And I think that it connected immediately with what Sopiak was talking about with the fish and the fish eggs, right? If the changes that we are seeing in our lives right now are going to affect the next generation. And we don't always know what those effects are going to be. And it ties in with what Amy was talking about, and especially maternal care and maternal health care and breastfeeding and babies, and how we keep mothers healthy, but also feeling safe and secure and solid so that babies can be raised in an environment that is not stressed and is wholesome for everyone. And I love listening to Midyalen and the way that she talks as a member of the youth collective in her Indigenous community, and talking about the things that are important. I was struck by the way that access to the internet is a need. This is a new need that people have. And I think that this ties in with some of what Amy was trying to get at in healthcare, that we're in this really dynamic space where there are technologies and there are things that we've learned that are useful and good and that people want. And then also questions about what benefits these things really are bringing and how we can incorporate these changes into a new way of living in the world. So I just thank you all so much for generating these possibilities. I want to begin. So now we have a few questions. Some of these are questions that we've agreed upon in advance. And so I'm just going to ask them, and we're going to go in the same order as our panelists answer them. So I'm going to ask the question, which is, will the shift toward locally led development, which is a lot of what people are talking about, is a really grounding what is happening in decision-making capacity for local people. So will the shift toward locally led development not only equalize the global north-south divide, but also the human and the natural world divide? So Sophia, will you lead us off?
I think yes, if we can do it, sure. I think the local people have a lot of wisdom for what environment they live in, and they have been learning how to live with their environment for generations, for hundreds of thousands of years. So there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom that they have learned for a long time in order to live sustainably, respectfully with those environment. And I think that we should learn from them, specifically how they live their life, and how much as an academic who reads books and articles and things that I know, but when I got there, try to understand the impacts of the changing of the river, of the dams on their life. I have to put my emotion into their life and experience that fully. And the more I engage in that, the more I know that it's hard to feel, it's hard to learn this way. But I think through learning this, then wisdom emerge in the sense of the clarities of like how much harm we do to environments if we are not living in it, if we are not listening to it directly. So I think their knowledge is important, their experience is important, and we should learn from them if we want to live with harmony with the nature and animals and other beings.
Nice, nice, and lovely points in there. Thank you. Thank you. Amy, what do you think about this?
Sure, thanks, Courtney. This is a topic, that goes back to the Paris agreements, and it's been on the agenda for decades, really. And unfortunately, I think we haven't made as much progress as we should. And I know that there's a renewed emphasis on locally led development in the United States with the USAID, United States Agency for International Development. Samantha Powers, the administrator, has really, again, put this high on their agenda, set some targets. And now there's policies and things out for review to say, is this how we go about doing it? And, in principle, locally led development is a really critical step toward local ownership and relevance and sustained change, effective change. It's really a matter of if and how we can actually do it, finally, maybe. For it to bridge the north-south divide, I think there has to be a true transfer of power. For instance, those at the local level have to set the agenda, they have to control the money, they have to determine how to use the money. So again, these are things that we have to put in place if locally led development is truly going to be enacted. The human natural world divide is an interesting question for me. I'm a global health practitioner. Of course, the environment on which we live, our planet, is critical, and there's so many interactions, and it's the climate health nexus. But I don't know if it's considered a priority to bridge that divide yet in the development sector, or at least maybe not as much in mine. And I don't know if it's recognized as what's needed to achieve the change that we want to achieve. And that also we have to get there for it to happen. The last thing I want to say is that I think it's really important to think about who are we defining as local when we say locally led development. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Nice. Thank you for that last one, right? Who is the local? Is it the government officials in the city? or is it the people in the landscape? Nice, thank you very much. Medallion, what do you think?
All right, it's Medialin. Thank you. All right, now to answer this question, for me, I would like to say that the process of development is not something that is new, nor there is a standardized blueprint for development, as it's not one size fits all. Having said that, if development were to be locally led, it may not mirror the definitions of development that is being used to define and measure the development in the North. Because, for instance, one of the markers of development in my country, Brunei Darussalam, is having a highly educated, skillful, and successful population that still holds dearly to the values of Malay customs and cultures, the teaching of Islamic laws, as well as the values towards the monarchy system. Now, in a more liberal and secular state, this may not be the way how development is being defined, or it is to be envisioned. It may even be considered the opposite of development, as we are trying to hold dearly the advancements of infrastructures alongside with the cultures and customs as well. If we persist on having the North as a standard to be equalized to, we may never reach the so-called equalization, as custom and culture of the said country, especially countries from the Southeast Asia that is so strongly bonded with their heritage, has different approach to what constitute as development plan. For instance, like I mentioned before, the MIB, Melayu Islam Beraja, our national philosophy, may have several opposition that argues it's not the pictures of development, but from our local perspective, it is how we define development, and that is the marker that we need to achieve should we consider ourselves to be developed. Yes.
Very nice, Medialin. Thank you for that. Yes, whose development are we talking about? Nice, nice, good. Sophie, what do you think?
Thanks. I'm like madly scrambling notes because everybody's sharing such important insights. I want to pick up on the question of knowledge and the transfer of power that Amy, you were touching on in your response there. I think, Sophia, I could not have put it better than you. Indigenous peoples and other rural communities hold wisdoms. Those wisdoms are indigenous forms of science that are sometimes glossed over or, placed somehow lower in the hierarchy of ways of knowing when they're referred to as traditional ecological knowledge. These are sciences, and they are what one of my indigenous friends calls sacred sciences that are not anchored in a divide between secular and scientific ways of being. So I think that shift towards, an equalization of global north-south divides and human natural relationships through locally led development really requires a transfer or a shift in power in terms of whose ways of knowing count in the world, and therefore which worlds count. A sort of epistemic transfer of power, one that doesn't, approach equalizing as erasing difference. Difference and diversity is always going to be part of the story of how we know and inhabit the world and how we then understand development. But it's about repurposing that difference in ways of knowing in more just and inclusive ways to kind of push against that monopoly over what development is or what development should be. So I think, reckoning with these grassroots forms of wisdom and leveling the playing field in terms of where science sits and where other ways of knowing the world sit is a really important epistemic move, but it's also a political move. And in other respects, you could see it as a decolonial move.
Nice, nice, excellent. I want to just draw out one little thing from this. It's been cooking in my own mind lately as well, and that's this power of the episteme and the way that so much of our knowledge, and so Pek, you said this so beautifully when you started, so much of our knowledge is mediated as consumers of this development project. Most of what we learn from books, we learn from reading, we learn from being taught by others. And And that privilege is a particular way of being in the world. And we are often surprised or jolted when we encounter the world of experiential knowledge, which is a different way of pulling things together. So I'm not gonna, I'm gonna bracket that for a second, and then I'm going to ask the second question to make sure that we get through them. So thank you all for these. Lovely. So the second question is taking a different side of the first question, taking the first question from a different angle. And the question is this: how might human-centered development processes and outcomes be reconciled with environmental well-being and multi-species justice? So again, we'll start with Sophia.
Okay, me first again. Yeah, I think the more I understand the impacts of environment, the more I see the distance that humans create from the environment, and the more we think that we develop, the more we think that we are better off than the species, the ecosystem that surround us. And then the more damage and harm we do to the environment and other species and each others. I think in order to reconcile that, we have to see that as one, human, environment, and everyone belong to each other and depend on each others. And then through that oneness of we create environment and they create us. Look at how distant we are from the environment by damaging it. And I think that to reconcile that, we have to see how environment shape us as much as how we shape environment. And through that, I think emotion play a very important role in how we register that kind of impact and register that kind of interconnectedness between human and non-humans and spiritual beings.
Nice, very well said. Very well said. Thank you. We'll just, yeah, Amy, you're ready.
Okay.
What do you think? Thank you.
So practitioner hat on, I think we can progress toward achieving this reconciliation via the One Health approach. I don't know if folks are familiar with this, but it's an area that recognizes and links the interdependencies across humans, animals, and the environment. It also aims to sustainably balance and secure the health of all three by bringing together multiple sectors, disciplines, communities at every level of society, and further, I think by focusing on inclusivity and equity, the One Health approach does touch on some of the points that I was making earlier. So I think it's not, the be all and end all, but I do think it's one way that we can begin to look at how to bridge these different realms and work collectively to achieve safe progress for all of us.
Nice. That's excellent. Thank you for bringing up One Health. I'll be excited to learn more about this. I'm only just hearing more about it right now. Lovely. Thank you. Media Lynn, what do you think?
Right. So I will be answering this question through my personal experience. Historically and culturally speaking, my tribe practices what we call as territorial migration. This is where we would settle on an area of a land, build settlement huts, hunts for food, practice mass agricultures. Should the land in which these agriculture takes place be exhausted of its natural nutrients, we would move to another place, leaving the used land the opportunity to heal itself and to rejuvenate itself again. So by the time we move back to the used land again, because it's quite seasonal, it's already been rejuvenated. Not only that, part of my tribe's knowledge is knowing how to spot the slightest signs of the seasonal change and what would work best with the agriculture, to the point that they have developed an ethnic calendar that revolves around the development of paddy. Now, having said that, perhaps one of the way to reconcile with the well-being of environment is to have someone in the decision-making chair be aware that you have to meet somewhere in between the needs of development, but also taking into considerations of what have worked best in the past based on the practices of the indigenous people of that area, because they have been doing it for centuries and it had worked. So to have those two being incorporated together, perhaps it can create a better sense and perspective towards how we approach development that is both taking into consideration the needs for us to develop as a human society, but also taking into account how we can pay tributes to the nature, because nature is something that we take very, very seriously in our culture because of our beliefs and also our deities worshipping during the harvesting seasons. So perhaps that the incorporations of traditional knowledge and also the decision-making people who are aware of putting those two things together. Yes, thank you.
Nice, thank you very much. We're hearing a lot of that here in Taiwan, the translating between these different fields of knowledge. Nice, thank you so much, Midialin. And Sophie, what do you think?
So I want to respond to this by thinking with recent developments in earth rights jurisprudence and ecological law, and in particular the recognition of landscapes and ecosystems as subjects of justice and as bearers of dignity. And I want to touch on that example because I think it offers a really, in some ways, promising shift in the paradigm of justice and by extension of what development can mean, land-based and ocean-based developments. When we start to take seriously the possibility of environments themselves as subjects and as consequential actors who are invested and implicated and affected by what development does. So, I'm thinking with, for instance, recognition of the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand as a subject of the law, territory as a victim of war in the Colombian Amazon. And there are a growing number of examples where, legal systems are thinking with relations between humans and more than humans, and adopting not individualism or anthropocentrism as the sort of core principle, but rather relations and relationality. And I think that's a promising avenue for reconciling human-centered development with environmental well-being and multi-species justice. And I just want to add one last thing, just going back to the point on the intergenerational dimensions of development that you invoked earlier, Courtney. I think there's something to be said here. Many of my Papuan friends are always asking themselves, when we think about development for humans and environmental protection, what kind of ancestors do we want to become? How do we want to be remembered by plants and animals and humans to come, right? So it's not just about development as the future-oriented, what will be for us, it's also how will we be remembered once we are departed, and will we be good ancestors or bad ancestors? That has implications for humans, past and present and future, but also for other than humans, past, present and future. And I love that idea of thinking not just about the future of development, but also how it will be remembered.
That is great. That is great. Thank you so much for that, Sophie. I sometimes tell my elite colleagues who, when I talk about these issues, look at me as if I have some strange growth growing out of the middle of my forehead. But I say, your grandchildren are going to be so mad at you. They're going to be so mad. But I love what's come out of this question, and especially the way that the ideas of One Health and the ideas of earth rights could possibly be a really nice foundation to begin a different kind of discussion about what we mean by development. So super nice. Thank you. I'm going to ask our third question, which actually relates to what I was just saying about about people thinking I'm so strange when I talk about this. But what contradictions and what impasses have each of you encountered as you travel this journey through development that we are all on, some of us consciously, some of us unconsciously. But what are the contradictions and or impasses that you encounter, either yourself or through what you see other people experiencing? And so Peck, you're ready. Go. Thank you.
I hope I understand the question right. I think as human being, what we are looking for is happiness, well-being. That's the sort of ultimate goal of life, meaning of life, a meaningful life. And development promise that it will do so by accumulating and making things faster, more convenient. And so that we will achieve that well-being and happiness. As we have done that for centuries now. Are we happier as human species? And who's happy here? Do the people who are rich now accumulate a lot now? Are they happy? And so I think under whose misery? So I think there's a lot of contradiction here is what it promised and what the outcomes are. I think for me personally, I don't seem to be a lot more content and happier by accumulating stuff. And it just go a little bit faster than, I don't need a 6-7G internet. It's fast enough for me now.
Nice. The little phrase that you just plopped in there, are we happier and under whose misery? That was powerful. Thank you. Amy, what do you think about this?
Courtney, in global health, we've relied quite a bit on research and evidence to set standards that countries have to follow. And it's often done without local knowledge or local evidence being taken into account or considered. And this is something that everyone, I think, on the panel spoke to quite eloquently in some previous responses to the questions. And it's a huge gap not to have local evidence part of the conversation, part of the standard setting. Because without it, we're not going to have locally credible or effective responses. So for me, that's a major, what did you call it? Look at my notes, a contradiction or an impasse in the work that I do.
Nice, very nice. Thank you. That's, yeah, we'll need to talk a lot about that. Midialin, what do you think?
Right. For this particular question, again, I will draw from my personal experience, focusing first on the positive impacts that development had brought to the community, my community. For instance, I have families living in the longhouses that belongs to one of the few rural area in Brunei Darussalam, one of which, had it not for the development of road within the past 30 to 50 years, would not be accessible. Now, with the development of road, we are now able to actually build a cell tower in which it made internet connection possible. Now, this is an interesting thing for me to see because I grew up watching the transformation from the road building to the cell tower building, and now they are using that internet connection combined with the existence of social media to showcase the products that's made by the residents of the longhouses. Then it becomes an economic opportunity for the people of the longhouses, my cousin, my aunties, my uncles, selling sustainable products made of rattan, such as bags and baskets. So they really capitalize what started from road development to something more of a place where they can earn revenues and profits, just practicing their culture as well. Now, when this attracts commercialization, our young people of Iban people would also be engaged to learn those particular knowledge of how to wave, how to basket as well. However, that's only on the positive side. Looking at the negative side, however, on the other side of the coin, reflecting on my personal experience, just this year alone, during when the world is still crazy with pandemic, my family received a devastating news from our relatives living in the neighboring country two of our family elders has been legally kicked out of their land, the land that they have been living for years, decades even. It's a place where I would go every school holiday to meet up with my cousin, place by the river, play around along the gardens and whatnot. Now I say that it's allegedly taken away from them because it's a very sensitive political topic, and I will tread this experience lightly. Now, when a charming, charismatic, trustworthy looking individual that promises grand reward came to the relative's home, it doesn't take much to convince them to waive away their rights with two signatures on a piece of document that in a language that they never even heard of, the English legal jargon, with the sweet promises, verbal sweet promises. Just two signatures is all it takes to rip their lands away that they have for decades or even centuries. Now, unfortunately, this is not one isolated cases. There has been numerous cases in this particular neighboring country that's been happening, and it has been brought to the news as well. Perhaps if you can search, the High Court actually rules against the protection land rights of the Iban tribes in this particular area to make way for plantations of oil palms or even rubber in the names of development. So over here, I'm a bit conflicted because from one side, I can see how it brings good to my people, how it preserved the culture, it engaged the young people of my tribe to practice that traditional heritage. On the other side, in the name of development, if it's not being taken care of carefully, they could have lost their identity. Unfortunately, now that the border is open, the family gathers together to find ways. We are still hearing the result from the court on this particular piece that we're fighting for, and we're just being hopeful at this moment. Yes.
Oh, Medialyn, thank you. That is a beautiful story, and it really so perfectly captures the powerful ambivalence of this project. It is at once good and horrible. Good luck to your family in their legal battle with the land. Sophie, what can you add to this?
It's always hard being last because everybody's covered the vital points. I just want to start by thanking Medialyn for entrusting us with those experiences and the experiences of your family. So contradictions or impasses. So thinking with the emergent oil palm plantation landscapes that I've been researching in West Papua this last decade, I think some of the greatest, I suppose, paradoxes of plantations as a form of land-based agricultural development is the ways in which these plantations are so often tethered in government and corporate discourse to the promise of progress, a promise of material progress that, of course, by virtue of the promise comes with assumptions of backwardness relating to the environments, the peoples, the knowledges that these plantations are supposedly, surpassing in one way or another. That, of course, does immense violence to the cultural textures and complexities of the peoples who have always protected and nourished these lands. It often comes associated with all kinds of racial forms of discrimination as well that only further entrench, the positioning of Indigenous Papuans as subhuman or even non-human before the law, and the paradox of plantations as progress has taken on some even greater, dimensions with the framing of palm oil as a source of renewable energy or biofuel, right? It's often talked about as this tree of hope that will allow us to move beyond non-renewable fossil fuels, and yet still the environmental and human impacts continue to haunt these capitalist natures. So I think that's a big contradiction, and it's a contradiction that's not just at play in this faraway plantation frontier that is West Papua, it's also a contradiction that's embedded in the complicity of people like myself, who are also participating in what Jabs Bir Buar calls determining the bodies that pay the price for progress. Sophiak Chan, you might enjoy reading Jabs Bir's work. It resonates so much with your point earlier about misery. So, you know, I am complicit in oil palm developments by the virtue or vice of the products I consume, by the fact that consumers have very limited ability to choose products that are palm oil free because it goes under some 250 different labels. That sense of complicity in the contradictions of development can come with a sense of paralysis when we feel unable to act or choose or do the right thing in the face of these seemingly insurmountable, you know, capitalist forces. Moving beyond that sense of paralysis, I think comes from conversations, talking with people in exactly these sorts of forums that we're in right now, being attentive to the stories and experiences and courage of people like Medialin, who are directly invested and implicated in grassroots movements towards just self-determined determination. And I just want to end on that because the sense of paralysis can be overwhelming. You know, being in dialogue, being in conversation, sharing and becoming vulnerable and acknowledging those sorts of complicities, I think is really, really important in the paving of, you know, pathways beyond the contradictions, or at least better ways of staying with the contradictions.
Nice, nice, very well said. I'm so glad that you brought up this brutal dynamic of complicity and paralysis. This is a hugely important part of the discussion that we need to be having. Can I impose upon you to pop into the chat box a link to the author that you mentioned? Yeah, lovely, thank you. Okay. And so we're doing pretty well on time. And so please, to our members of our audience, please begin popping your questions into the chat box and the Q&A. Looks like there's a few in the Q&A already. And we have one more question that we have agreed upon, and it's short, but hopefully will be a nice way to round out the discussion that we've been having. So the question is, what is it, in your personal opinion, is being developed under the banner of development? And so we'll just take the same order. So Pat.
Yeah, I think so. Look at from the political economy point of view, is a lot have been accumulated in terms of material, money and power. So sort of under this development, sort of power, money flow in the directions in a certain ways. So who gain that kind of control? And under all of this, it still doesn't promise happiness and well-being. I would say what driving this is fear. And why do we need that much to live a life in this world, in this time and age? What is our sort of what is in the mind of developers that need to accumulate that much, and for what? I think that's what driving it is pretty much fear.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. We can unpack that. Good. Thank you. Amy, what do you think?
I mean, development work is very contentious. I think we've heard that across this conversation. And what it means and if it's effective is also pretty uncertain. I think over the last 40 to 50 years, who has been developed, what has been developed. You know, we have some examples of success, eradication of smallpox, although maybe coming back. But, you know, there are things that have been accomplished, but at what cost as well. And I was recently introduced to this donut economics model, which I thought was pretty interesting because it is about the planetary boundaries that we can develop. There are certain core development needs that we have as humans, but that we need to be mindful of the planetary boundaries in which we're living so that we don't go beyond those. And I think a lot of the development practice hasn't considered those boundaries. It's really just always been about more and more and more growth, which I think other panelists have spoken to much more eloquently. But I would say the jury's out. Is development effective? Let's see.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Medialyn, from your part of the world, what do you see?
I see, to approach this question, what is being developed under the banners of development? Well, from my perspective, in order to be considered as developed, it would be the incorporations of the traditional customs and belief while elevating the standards of living of not only those who enjoys it in the capital, but also being being put back into developing the standards of living of people, ethnic minorities in the rural area. Meaning to say, development should be where the standard of everyone's life should be improved through the buildings of infrastructure, while at the same time does not jeopardize nor violate the rights of the people that have lived in the land in which that particular development take place. Now, I know it sounds like, utopian context, but I choose to remain optimistic that one day we can find sort of balance between developments and also preserving our identities as ethnic minorities. Yeah, that's all from me.
Okay, very nice, very nice. Thank you. And Sophie, what do you think?
This was a tricky one. Part of me wants to say that, what I see as being developed under the banner of development is actually grassroots counter or alter developmentalisms. That is to say, ways of thinking about futures and progress and well-being and nourishment and relationship that are countering some of the most fundamental assumptions that have traditionally undergirded Western driven or Western centric understandings of the good life. So I'm certainly not saying that non-Western, Indigenous and other ways of thinking about well-being necessitated these sort of dominant discourses in order to surface. But what I'm saying is that in some ways, the response of Indigenous food sovereignty movements, for instance, territorial sovereignty movements, racial and social justice movements, and so forth, have in some ways been seeded very much by the kinds of dominant developmental discourses that don't necessarily align with the values and the ways of being and knowing the world that these peoples and communities have entertained since time immemorial. And so I think the potential for counter or alter movements, other ways of thinking about development, multiplying how we understand development, thinking about it as a situated, specific, locally grounded practice rather than a top-down sort of one-size-fits-all, as one of the fellow panelists said earlier, rightly said earlier, I think is what's happening, and I think it's exciting.
Nice, lovely. Thank you all so much for your excellent insights. And I was just struck, and I'll share this for a minute, thinking about Medialyn's kind of a wish for what development could be. I was struck by a thing when I was studying women's studies, and the feminist movement was being critiqued. The feminist movement started with the elite white women who were demanding to be released from their homes. We want freedom. We want to be able to do what we want to do. And at the same time, and part of what began a different sort of conversation about what feminism is when the entire collective of marginalized women came together and said, no, we want our families back. I want all of my children here with me. I don't want them all over the world working in factories. I don't want my husband gone. I want my family here. And so there are these profoundly different experiences of what it is we need to be happy, as Supiak points out, right? To find that space of peace and contentment. And the difficult thing about that is that it can't be scaled, and can't be a program that you can roll out everywhere across the world. It has to be local. And so there's some work to do there. We do have some questions from the audience, so I'm gonna just lay those on you as they have come in. So from Visa Think, we have this question. She says, rule of development and rule of law in this development context. And she asks, whose rules? And who benefits from the rules, and who gains and who loses from these rules? And so I think that this speaks to what a number of you have been talking about. Does anybody want to jump in first on this? Media Lynn, I think you might have something to say about this. Would you like to speak on this one?
All right, I'll give it a try. All right. Okay, let me read the questions again. Rules of development and rules of law in this development context. Yes, coming from my perspective, it is quite a contradictions, because at one side, I've seen how good it brings, and one side, how bad it could bring. Now, in this particular context, rules, at least from my experience, are determined by those who are sitting in the office, and for whom actually, now that is a very, very sensitive answer that I might need certain help from our fellow panelists to help as well. And who benefits from these rules? Now, again, if the person in the decision-making chair decided to take into account the way of life of people in this the land that is being developed, trust me, everyone would at least to some point enjoy the benefits of it all. Because when you are trying to develop a certain land, let's not think about how one group of community in the society benefits, but it should be inclusive of everyone as well. So there should always be a give and take, a learning process of before a particular policy is being made or being decided upon. So I think I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, nice. That was very nice. Thank you. Does somebody else have something they want to add? Sophie, you look like you want to add something.
Sure, I'm happy to throw something in. Yeah, it's a great question. I hadn't actually thought about the rule of development and its relationship to the rule of law. And I was thinking about your response just there, maybe Aline, about where law and rule is made from. In Indonesia, there's a very famous expression, which is that the law is hukum tajam ke bawah dan tupul ke atas, which means the law is like a knife. It's sharp at the bottom and blunt at the top. So, if you chop the top of the blunt, people who are privileged, aren't affected as much by the rule of law, or they can get around it. But the knife is damn sharp at the bottom where the people are. So, yeah, I think thinking about where these laws and rules are stemming from, who is seen as the subject of development, whether it's individuals or collectives, is really important to that sort of understanding that relationship. And I think here, particularly in the context of, collective land rights and communal land tenure systems that are, so prevalent in so much of the global South, particularly among Indigenous peoples, there's a need to think beyond the subject of rules and of the law as not an individual, but a collective, collectives of people across time, collectives of non-human people, the plants and the animals who are also subjects of development in some ways. So expanding the scope of who is the subject of rule and law more creatively and capaciously and inclusively, I think, is important. Sorry, that wasn't particularly coherent. Too many thoughts. Great question.
No, that was great. I love the metaphor of the knife. Thank you. I'll be using that. We have a few more questions. Amy or Sopek, do either of you want to jump in on this one now, or should we keep going?
I'm okay for now.
Yeah, let's keep going. Thanks.
All right, good. So the next question from Panjarsi Tongare is, how does the role of local leadership influence on the relationship between people and nature in the community and in the shift of development? Ellen, I see you laughing again. I'm gonna actually ask Sophia to start on this one, because I think you might have some insights on this, on local leadership and this impact with developments.
That's tricky because it's hard to find the worlds now that the local is not influenced by the outside. And when you talk about local leadership, how do you who's lead the local is, you know, and we have to also understand the power dynamic within the local as an outsiders. To what extent should we intervene into that kind of decision making? And we question ourselves, what is our influence in the situation when the leadership is kind of being chosen, who will lead this? And so I think that's very tricky, and I still find it very hard, very difficult, because, you know, corruption's everywhere within the local. There's also the power dynamics, violence, inequality. So I would say as an outsiders, we have to view ourselves. What can we say in a particular context? I don't think we can make a rule of like what a local leadership should look like.
Nice. That's really well said. And it reminds me of some of the things that Amy was talking about earlier. Amy, I wonder if you have something that you want to add to this.
I think Sophia was quite eloquent. I'm not sure I have a lot to add, but I think the question is how are we defining local? And a local leader may not really represent the community that they're leading. And so we need to really unpack that and figure out those dynamics and be sure that we're not focused all our energy on gathering local evidence and local knowledge from local leaders alone. It has to really be from the broader community itself.
Nice. Yes, definitely. Lynn, do you have something you wanted to add to this?
I'm okay with this. Thank you.
Sophie?
Same
I
here.
can add a little bit more. I think I saw a very interesting proverb somewhere. They said leadership is not about the leader, it's about the cultures. So I think better understand the culture of the power dynamic within the particular community and how much we can do from there. So we focus on the relationship, the dynamics that are being built, and not on the individuals that we sort of talking to.
Yeah, definitely. I know I see in Cambodia that leaders from the dominant population are put into villages of indigenous people as an act of governance. So yeah, good. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for that question. And we'll go on to our next one from Van Bien Dong. And she has a question. This question is specifically for Media Len. How does the traditional belief influence on the relationship between Iban and the nature?
Right. First of all, very, very good questions. Now, I would like to put a disclaimer that there are multiple types of Iban. They're from different parts of the Borneo Islands. I will try to summarize all three to give you a more holistic answers in these particular questions. Now, traditionally speaking, Iban people would develop a sort of a calendar system in which we track down the developments of paddy, inclusive of its harvesting season. Now, in doing that, we also take into account the slightest change when the land is no longer, how we say it, bernyawa. It's like tidak hidup. It means that it's not alive anymore. So once we have noted that slightest change, culturally speaking, we would create a lot of rituals, but it would also be a moment where, traditionally speaking, the Iban people would move away from that land and move to another to give that land the opportunity to rejuvenate itself. Now, contrary to what is being the driving force of commercializations of agriculture, when the land is when the land is being exhausted, people would think of another future forward science related solutions when the tradition and this particular chemical that's being put into that crops might affect the other ecosystems surrounding it as well. So from my perspective, how does IBAN influence and belief connects the tribes to the nature? I would say there's a saying in my particular religion, in my particular ethnic, it says, Ari tanah kita hidup, ari tanah kita pulai. Means that we are from the land, we're being born from the land, and we will return to the land itself. So the respects that we have, should the land itself say that they're exhausted, giving them space for the natural process to take over, is what I would say how these two can be connected stronger in terms of developing, in terms of agricultural economic system. I hope that answers your questions.
That is a really nice answer. Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Medialin. Sorry. Okay, so we have a question here now from Jonathan Winterton. And he says that that we have here a plurality of voices that are being championed here. And he wonders, is that a fair comment? He says, but what about those without voices? Those that have been silenced by, for example, the mass media or by political rulers? Who gets to speak for those who go unheard? Says he apologizes for the slightly metaphysical question, but he's thinking of dispossessed people such as the Orang Ulu in the uplands of Sarawak, on which Medialin is discussing. There's a silent discourse of development that no matter how hard we as scholars might try to identify, most often goes unheard and overlooked. This is a very provocative question. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I'm happy to offer some thoughts, although of course, Medialin, I would also love to hear your thoughts on that question. I don't think it's metaphysical at all. It's such an important question, the one you're asking, who gets to speak for those who go unheard. It's an ontological question, it's an epistemological question, it's an affective question, it's a political question, it's an ethical question, it's the whole lot. So thank you so much for opening the space for that conversation, Jonathan. I think, you know, one of the struggles I've certainly faced in, as a non-Indigenous anthropologist operating from a discipline that has long been tethered to colonial racial capitalist visions and missions, I've been really aware of the risk sometimes of, framing dispossession and Indigenous experiences solely through damage-centered narratives. And I'm borrowing this term from the Native American Anangax scholar Eve Tuck, who cautions about stories that are only about loss and destruction and suffering and crisis, because she notes that Indigenous worlds are just as much about that as they are about survivance and continuance and resurgence and world making, and unexpected acts of defiance and resistance and opposition that even the term resistance doesn't quite fully encompass. So I'm not offering at all a practical answer to the question. I'm just perhaps offering a note of caution that those forms of ongoingness and survivance that are more than survival, because they're about sovereignty and self-determination, are also part of the story of dispossession. And I think one of the challenges with development is perhaps moving away from deficit or discourse-centered narratives to also do justice to those forms of resilience, I suppose, forms of resilience that are enduring and ongoing, even as the soil is exhausted and dying, to return to Medialin's invocation of soils earlier. I'll leave it at that.
Nice. Medialin, do you want to jump in on that?
Right. So I will give my best. All right. On this particular comments or questions, I would say that as a IBAN, whenever I look into the academia's papers throughout my undergraduate studies, there has been a little number of publication highlighting on this particular issues. But I believe this is because, number one, the accessibility to data is quite difficult, because when you are about to interview this particular indigenous people, they have to take into account the security of their living, because this is a very sensitive topic. And should they say the wrong thing, something could affect them and their family. And it's like a sort of an open secret out there that people knows, but perhaps our voice are being suppressed because of the fear that we might face should we be so outspoken about it. So one way to approach this particular topic is to play with the water first, to insert few a collectives approach that doesn't focus on one specific race, but rather a multiple groups of ethnic minorities. So if it's just one singular ethnic group, it might not gather much attention. But believe me, when I say Iban people is not the only one being affected in Sarawak, it actually affects multiple ethnics. And again, the fear is there. Should someone be outspoken about this, a particular action would be taken against their family, because again, this is the purpose of development, and development is viewed from the interest of certain people at the top levels of the community. So again, for someone to approach this particular matters, it needs to be taken carefully and not just bulldoze it into the research itself, because not only the researcher's life is on the line, but the people that is living there while the research is being conducted is affected directly first. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Very well said. Very well said. Nice. And we hear this element of fear coming up again that Sopak mentioned earlier. This is so important. Sometimes the silence is self-censoring. Sometimes it's a deliberate silence. And sometimes voices are silenced. The voices of researchers are often silenced. Yes, nice, good. I'm going to jump to the last question, and then there's one more in there that will probably have, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. Okay, so this next question is from Paul Carnegie, and he says that the mismatch between the generic character of national level development systems, development decisions, and its ability to achieve effective uplift for local communities is not easily resolved. In my experience, if development donors and associated political elites making public development decisions at the national level remain preoccupied with what development should look like rather than with what it does, then local communities will continue to struggle. My question is, how do we bridge the disconnect between ways of doing things deeply embedded in traditional sociocultural structures of meaning, kinship, and authority with the forms of development demanded by impersonal market relations? And so actually, I am going to do this, and I'm going to add it to this last question, which I think is really provocative. And this is an anonymous attendee. And this person asks, can and should the futures of communities and local environments be understood through the development discourse? Right. So I understand this question to be asking, is the discourse of development the appropriate language to be discussing these things in? So what do you think? Who would like to speak to that? Amy, can you add something to these questions? We just haven't heard from you in a couple of rounds.
I know, thanks for the offer, but I need to absorb that one. It's, the language used frankly is not a lot of the language that I use in my work. So I need some more time to understand. I'd love to hear from somebody else.
Okay. So
Okay.
Pek, I see you're ready. Good, thank you.
I think, yeah, I mean, the word develop to me mean progress. We keep moving, non-stop. It's keep going and going and going, and then we lose the balance. And what it doesn't capture whatever sustainable and what benchmark we measure that sustainability, go back to where and when. I think even the word sustainable development doesn't seem to sort of get. I think the word balance may be more balance of between whom, between what. And this sort of the balance can bring stability in terms of progress, and lose the balance and lack of stability. So I think for me, the word balance, how we balance, how do we move with balance? How do we balance our movement? And that is, for me, it's more, more relevant and more useful way to capture how human progress.
Maybe I'm ready, if that's okay. Just, I mean, not to say
That's
quite a
perfect,
lot,
thank
but
you.
I mean, I think it harkens back to some of what I was saying before about the idea that, it needs to be about equity and safety and options. And that's, ideally development isn't about overriding existing cultures and norms and belief systems. It's really about bolstering those to affect positive change, at least in like the ideal world. I know that's not how it's always practiced, but I think that's, in my view, that's where we should be in our development practice, to ensure that people do have safe options, like I said earlier, around their healthcare. Where do you want to receive your care? It should be culturally relevant. The providers need to have cultural literacy and clinical capacity. So I think, if I'm understanding the question well, there should be the ability to bridge those two things.
Good, nice. That was very well said. We have, so Pekka, suggesting that we're not seeking progress, but we're seeking balance. That's a really nice way to go at it. And I really like, Amy, that in addition to equity and safety, which I think is I hear all the time in development speak, you add this really important element of options, right? That it's not a single path. Being developed is not the same everywhere. That's nice. That's nice. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. Media Lynn, do you have something that you want to add to this last question?
I'm good for now.
Okay. Sophie, what do you think?
I just want to follow up from Sofia's point on balance. I mean, balance is what ecosystems and ecology is all about, right? Relationship between parts that together make a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. So when we think through balance, it brings in relationships, it brings in, accountabilities, and perhaps it also brings in discourses or ideas of justice that could operate alongside questions of development and questions of balance in terms of planetary health, social justice, and all the other inflections and manifestations that a just life or a good life can take. Just a small part.
Nice. Oh, just delightful. I want to thank you all so much for your really insightful additions to this discussion of development, right? What is it? What are we developing? There's a couple of things that I think came out that I want to just sort of end with. And that's this idea of affect and being affected. And I think I can hear from all of you that as we are working in our lives, sometimes in the office, sometimes with people where they live, sometimes in our own families and where we live, we are affected and we are embedded in this system, in this process of change and of seeking balance and development and improvement, right? In search of a happier, more stable and safer place to live, where we don't have fear. Sepek this and both Sepek and Media Lynn brought up fear, and it's such a driving element in a lot of what we see in local communities that are facing the impacts of development. So I just want to thank you all. Thanks to the audience for your terrific questions, and really what a great panel. I'm just so delighted to have been able to get to know you and honored to hear all of the things that you had to share with us. So we have our next webinar will be on October 19th, and we will be discussing development in the context of roads and land. So I hope many of you will join us for that. And thank you again to our amazing panelists and to the collective at the Luce Foundation and at University of Michigan and University of Hawaii that helped put this all together. So thank you all, and I will look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.